Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on handling emerging issues in GST instigating litigation, which has been jointly organized by ASSOCHAM and Tattvam Advisors. Tattvam Advisors is a renowned indirect tax firm offering services ranging from advisory, audit, compliance, support to departmental handling and litigations. Tattvam has a team strength of 5 partners and 40 professionals and are catering to more than 100 corporates and MNCs. I would just like to briefly introduce to all the speakers that we have with us today. We have Mr. J.K. Mittal, who is a co-chairman of ASSOCHAM National Council on Indirect Taxes. He is a law graduate from Delhi University and a practicing advocate, particularly in indirect taxes in High Court and Supreme Court. Mr. Mittal is a member of Supreme Court Bar Association and Delhi High Court Bar Association. He is also a fellow member of the ICAI and a fellow member of Institute of Company Secretaries of India. He is also a regular speaker in various conferences, seminars, and workshops organized by chambers and institution bodies. Supreme Court Bar Association has honored Mr. J.K. Mittal several times on the occasion of Law Day. We have with us Mr. C.A. Tushar Agrawal, who is a founder partner of Tattvam Advisors, having more than 10 years of experience in indirect taxes. He has worked for more than 8 years with Lakshmi Kumar and Sridhan Attorney and was also deployed by the GSTN for GST implementation. He has worked closely with the government officials and Government of India in designing of GST returns, audit, and other formats. C.A. Preetham Goyal is a founder partner of Tattvam Advisors, having over 10 years of professional experience in the field of indirect taxes and valuation. His specialization lies in structuring business operations, GST advisory, GST department audit, and advisory support in the field of indirect taxes. He has been deeply involved with various industries ranging from real estate, BPO, manufacturing, EPC, hospitality, etc. for ensuring proper indirect tax related compliance and tax related structuring. We also have with us C.A. Geetika Srivastava, who holds experience of nearly 12 years in the field of indirect taxes. She has worked with Lakshmi Kumar and Sridharan and PwC prior to joining Tattvam Advisors as executive partner. She has been instrumental in advising GST during the setting up of GST portal with specific focus on returns, refund, back office, etc. She has worked for clients across sectors ranging from logistics, oil and gas, telecommunication, banking, e-commerce, FMCG, etc. I would like to inform all the attendees to keep posting your queries in the question and answer box, which would be responded by the expert after the presentation. Now, I would like to invite Shri J.K. Mittal, co-chairman of ASSOCHAM National Council on Indirect Taxes, to deliver the welcome address for this book.
Thank you, Mr. Vinas. Can all of you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Vinas, and all the participants. This is very important webinar for handling of emerging issues in litigations. In fact, once GST was started almost 4 years back, and we never thought there would be huge scope for the litigations or the trade and industry will be facing such a huge challenge of litigations. Therefore, as any other topic in the GST also, we have to prepare ourselves. And being a member of the trade and industry, one can understand that if a challenge of litigations comes, it has a huge stakes. And particularly in our country, when the litigation continue for longer period, because you have to cross the hurdles of, the tribunals, High Court, Supreme Court. Ultimately, every litigation goes up to the Supreme Court. And in the GST, tribunal has not yet constituted because of the Madras High Court decisions. This is also another challenge. And issuance of the summons, which is also one of the topics today for discussions. The summon has become like way of life in the indirect taxes. The officers feel like that they can summon each and every one and to at any level. I have never seen in the income tax, the summoning power is so misused. Here, it would not be, out of context to say it. Even if the public sector, the superintendent level officers doesn't mind even to issue summons to the CMD. In any other company also, they ask the, the mobile number and the address of the managing director or the directors. Therefore, this would be the one of the very, very important topics, how the summons, should be issued. The fake invoice is the another, the challenge. हिंदी में बोलूंगा एक लाइन, कहते हैं किसी झूठ को 100 बार बोलो तो सच लगने लगता है. The fake invoices has become like a buzzword. Every person is being arrested by the officers by saying that there is a fake invoice, the peoples are involved in the this jugglery, and they are not entitled for the input tax credit, and they arrest peoples. And the court also see that there is a the serious allegations, therefore why not you should be put behind the bar. The question is very, very important, which I will request my fellow participant to discuss in detail. The two aspects in this. First thing is that in the indirect taxes, we have to make a distinction, from the criminal law. Under the criminal law, merely because you are suspect, the FIR is registered and you could be arrested. But in indirect taxes, it is not like that. It is the reason to believe, and which has been explained in the several judgment. That means you have to have a materials, you would have examined it. After that, you would have made a report by a competent officer. He himself has to take a decisions, and then only the proceedings start. Therefore, not only on the basis of suspects, but what I have experienced, what my fellow colleague would have experienced, that merely because an allegations one is arrested, that is, I think, the totally wholly illegal approach under the indirect taxes. I have gone through the some portion yesterday, the Income Tax Act. There under section 131, there is a specific provision. Even on the suspects, a person can be summoned. But that is a specific provision is there in the Income Tax Act. But no, there is not a similar provision in the GST law. Therefore, one has to deliberate, on these issues. And therefore, all the participants, those who are attending this, for them become a very, very important, the topic for the discussions. And particularly in the context, once, almost what I have experienced, that whether you are a small or a big, whether you are a public sector or private sector, if you have not received the summon, it would be news for them. They are issuing the summons to everybody, each and everybody. Another aspects one can discuss it, whether the summon, can be executed at the time of search. Generally, unusual practice are being followed in the indirect taxes. When the search is being conducted, at that time, a summons are issued on the spot, statements are recorded, whether that is legal, proper or not. Second aspects, which is contrary to even their own manual, which is DGCI issued the manual, which as per the circular is applicable in the GST law also. Whether the summon can be issued frequently. What I have seen today, you will get a summon, day after tomorrow again summon, after a week again summon. How many summon can be issued? Would it be a the power can be used anytime? That is also very interesting to discuss about it. Another aspects which I think I'm just flagging some of the points which I'm sure all the attendees are looking forward to hear from all of you. That once a summon is issued, they ask persons to sit, and they are recording in the summon itself. You should not leave our office without our permission. Though recently I also got an opportunity to challenge it and got a stay also. And the High Court was very kindly recorded this statement also. Why the summons are being issued by recording that you should not leave the office without our permission, etc. Whether that is legally, logically permissible or not, what is the intention? And when the peoples are being called, they remain in office for late hours, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, even entire night. Whether that is the way, because their GST manual, their DGCI manual clearly state the summon proceeding should be conducted normally in the officials' hours. And the repetitive summons should not be issued, para 99 of their manual. Therefore, these aspects become very important. Another aspect that whether issuance of summons to the managing director, at the first instance. One can remember that I was closely associated, because we are associated with the SHM and PSD, that we represented to the government that the summons are being misused. In 2007 February and again in 2015, the two instructions were issued. At the first instance, summons should not be issued. Second thing is, the summons should not be issued to the higher management officials like the director, etc. Despite that, these are being issued. Therefore, one has to find out the solution of that. Even if the governments are issuing summons and still these are continuing practice are being followed, how it would be, tackled. And in case of fake billing, another point it came in my mind, which SHM has taken, very seriously. If you can remember, the last year, a committee was constituted by the Government of India to decriminalization of the GST law, like the present government has already done in the case of Companies Act to greater extent. It is like that, पहले गवर्नमेंट चाहती है क्रिमिनलाइजेशन के प्रोविजन लेके आओ, फिर जल्दी से उनको पता चलता है कि ये प्रोविजन बेनिफिट की बजाय लॉस दे रहे हैं, क्योंकि असेसी जो इनोसेंट है उसको फंसाया जाता है, और जो रियल क्रिमिनल होता है वो तो देश छोड़ के भाग ही जाता है. उसकी तो लगता है जैसे पूरे ऊपर से नीचे तक साठगांठ ही है. तो ऐसे के अंदर वो जो डीक्रिमिनलाइजेशन की कमेटी बनी, उसका क्या रहा, हमें कुछ पता नहीं चल पाया. डिस्पाइट बीइंग वी आर द चैम्बर ऑफ कॉमर्स रिप्रेजेंटेड, पार्टिसिपेटेड इन दैट, and the government was very keen to decriminalization of the GST offenses, and particularly some of the offenses are already an offense under the IPC. So how there could be again an offense under the GST law also. Therefore, with these words, I won't take much time, because my time was allocated for about 10 minutes, which I have passed through the now. I leave the the floor and giving back to the Avinash to conduct the proceeding. Though I can rejoin if some of the questions, if it is put by any of the attendees, then at the end I can rejoin the webinar. I wish all the best to every participant, and my fellow colleagues will definitely do the justice, for the topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. And the question will be there in the question box, and we request you to kindly join to respond to the queries of the participants. Now, I would like to invite CA Tushar Agrawal to give his presentation and hand over the stage to him to follow the
Thank you, Avinash ji.
presentation with his colleagues. Yeah.
Sure. I'm just sharing my screen. Good afternoon to all the participants. We hope you all are doing good and staying healthy. Friends, we are about to complete 4 years of GST implementation. In last 4 years, we have seen number of amendments, thousands of circulars, notifications, judgments, advance ruling. The GST law is still evolving and developing. In fact, in last 1 year, we have seen that the department has become very active. We have started issuing notices on various subject matter, be it 2A, 3B mismatch, be it related to rate classification, be it related to discount schemes. In fact, we are also facing problem related to the parallel proceedings. And as rightly said by Mittal sir, summon is something I think every corporate has witnessed. So what we have done is, for this particular session is, we have chosen 6 topics. So we will be deliberating on these 6 topics and also discussing in detail how to handle them practically. And in fact, if a notice is issued, how to put the grounds in that particular notice, how do you prepare your reply? We will start with our first issue, how to handle the departmental notices for difference between GSTR 2A and 3B, and whether are we required to actually reverse the credit Friends, such notices can be issued either under Section 61 as a part of scrutiny of return or as a show cause notice under Section 73 or kind of a normal communication. So we have been witnessing such kind of notices being issued to the taxpayers in various states. So whenever we receive such notices, how do we draft our reply? How do we respond? And what should be my stand? To discuss this, we will divide our entire discussion into three parts. The first part is for the period 1st July 2017 till 8th October 2019. Why 8th October? Because from 9th October, Rule 36(4) was inserted, which specifically that said that the maximum credit available to the taxpayer is what is coming in the portal plus 20%. Thereafter, now it is 5%. The second period is from 9th October 2019 till budget 2021 amendment becomes effective. So we will discuss about this amendment also. So we will divide our second period post Rule 36(4) till this budget amendment becomes effective. So we will start with our first period 1/7/2017 till 8th October 2019. If I have claimed credit during this period, I have filed my 3B and I get a notice that there is a mismatch between what I have claimed in 3B vis-a-vis what is coming in 2A. How do we respond? The first step is whenever you get a notice, say the demand is for 5 crore rupees for the purpose of example. They say that my 2A is showing 6 crore rupees. I have taken credit in 3B as 11 crore rupees. There is a difference of 5 crore rupees. Please pay along with interest and penalty. The first thing is to always do an updated reconciliation, the first step, because whatever figure is quoted in the notice, we have personally seen that that figure is incorrect. And if you compare that figure with your updated 2A, then you will realize that most of the credit will automatically get matched. So you do an updated repo and submit in your reply that this is a wrong figure and the correct figure is so and so forth. So by virtue of this, it may so happen that your mismatch actually is not 5 crore rupees, but only 3 crore rupees. Second step, with respect to this 3 crore rupees mismatch, you have to divide this into two categories. First category will be those kinds of vendors who will say that I have effectively deposited tax in 3B, but by virtue of any clerical mistake, I was not able to report in GSTR1 or I reported wrongly. What can be the reasons? There may be a case where your vendor has recorded something in B2C, but it was a B2B supply. So it will not be reflected in your 2A. Second situation can be he has written a wrong GSTN number and he has actually missed out and now the time to rectify has lapsed. So in such situation, your vendor is saying that he has actually paid the money in 3B, but it's only a clerical mistake in GSTR1. So in this case, in our view, there will be no reversal which will be required. It's a settled law that procedural lapse cannot deny the substantive benefit. In this case, the supplier itself is saying that he has actually paid the tax in 3B. It's only a mistake in GSTR1. So what you should do as a tax recipient, please take undertaking from your supplier, asking to provide you an undertaking stating that he has supplied goods and services to you under these and these invoices. He has paid the tax on these invoices in the GSTR 3B of this and this month, but by mistake, the amount cannot be reported in GSTR1. So in our view, basis such undertaking, reversal will not be required. And in our real reply, we should always write that out of these mismatched report, these vendors have actually paid the tax. It's only a procedural mistake and hence reversal not required. What about the other set of vendors? Those sort of vendors who are not cooperating with me, who have not filed GSTR1, who have not filed GSTR 3B, I don't know what is their status. They may even be unregistered as of now. Am I required to reverse the credit? In my view, in such cases also for the relevant period, that is from 1/7/2017 till 8th October 2019, reversal is not required. And why not required? This is based on 5 major grounds. So we will be discussing 5 major grounds which should always form part of our reply. Ground number 1. When we see section 16(2)(c), it starts with subject to the provision of section 41, the tax charge in respect of such supply has been actually paid to the government. So section 16(2)(c), which imposes this condition that the tax should be paid by the supplier to the government, it starts with the subject clause. It says it is subject to the provision of section 41. And when we move on to section 41, 41 is a process of taking the provisional credit and it has to be read along with section 42. Section 42 and rule 69 and 71. All read together is a complete code for matching, reversal, and reclaim of ITC. So it's a complete code. When we read section 42, 42(3), 42(5), rule 69, 71, we will see this entire matching principles, which is there in the GST law, which is there in the act and the rules, is based on 3 kinds of returns. That is GSTR1, GSTR2, GSTR3. And then we have GST MIS1 report, GST MIS2 report. Today, as on date, We don't have a concept of GSTR2. It is kept in abeyance. We don't have a concept of GSTR3. We don't have a concept of GST MIS1 on portal. We don't have a concept of GST MIS2 on portal. So in fact, when GSTR2, 3, MIS1 forms are not available as of now, the entire system has been kept on hold due to technical glitches. And what is prevalent is only a default return filing system of GSTR1 and 3B. Then how can section 42 and 41 can be implemented in the absence of such forms? And if section 41 and 42 cannot be implemented, how can section 16(2)(c) be implemented? So the first ground should be, in my view, section 16(2)(c) not implementable because it is based subject to section 41, 42, which itself is totally based on GSTR 1, 2, 3, MIS1, MIS2, and the entire system has been kept on hold. Hence, no reversal required under this particular section. And to collaborate this, in fact, in this 43rd council meeting, they have specifically said that they will change all the acts and all the rules and will make GSTR 1 and 3B as a return default filing system in the law. So this is something which they will do. They have not done. So for the past period, as of now, what is there in the law? It is GSTR 2, 3, MIS1, not at all operational. Hence, no reversal required. Coming to the second point. The law cannot compel you to do something which is impossible. It's a settled principle. You cannot be compelled to do something impossible. So as a recipient, how you can check whether he has actually paid the tax to the government or not? Friends, if you recall, in 17 and 18, there was no GSTR 2A. GSTR 2A was introduced for the first time in September or October 2018. At that time, you came to know that whether the supplier has uploaded the invoice or not. And before that, you were never aware. Even if it is coming in GSTR 1, even if it is auto-populated in your GSTR 2A, even if in fact it is getting auto-populated, it does not mean that he has paid the tax. It only means that he has uploaded the invoice on GSTR 1, but there may be a situation he has not filed GSTR 3B. So in fact, the fact that he has filed 3B or not is now started showing in GSTR 2A a couple of months ago only. So there can in fact be a case where he has filed GSTR 1, he has filed GSTR 3B, still there is a tax evasion he has not paid to the government. How? There is a possibility that in GSTR 1, he has uploaded invoices of 5 crore rupees. But in GSTR 3B, he has just shown 5 lakh rupees and filed 3B. As a recipient, what will be seen? You will just see that an invoice is coming in 2A and GSTR 3B is filed. But actually, he has not paid the amount to the government. So as on today, the technical system, the GSTN system does not support me in checking whether the tax has been paid against that particular invoice or not. Earlier, when GST was being implemented, what was the position at that time? Whatever I would have shown in GSTR 1, that was supposed to get auto-populated in GSTR 3, and I could not have changed the figure in GSTR 3. My GSTR 1 figure is 5 crore, GSTR 3 figure will be 5 crore only, and cannot change like 3B. So today, I cannot actually check whether he has paid the tax to the government or not on that particular invoice. Ground number 3rd, relying upon all old VAT judgments. There, beautifully, the courts have come out with a distinction between a bona fide buyer and a fraudulent buyer. What the court says that no liability could be fastened on a buyer on account of non-payment of tax by the seller in the treasury unless a case of fraud is made or a collusion between the seller and buyer is established. So I should write in my letter that I am a bona fide buyer, I have satisfied all the conditions. Relying upon this judgment, no reversal required. Ground number 4, a recent Madras High Court judgment, wherein the issue was that the officers, the department started investigation of a seller. There they came to know that the tax has not been paid. So what they did, they straight away went to the buyer, asked him to reverse the credit, to which the court held that, why are you coming to the buyer directly? Firstly, examine the sellers, try to recover from them. Why are you coming directly to the buyer? So this should be my ground that I am a bona fide buyer. I have taken credit based on all the conditions which I have satisfied. You go and recover from the seller. I have reimbursed the amount to him. This provision is arbitrary, and to 5th ground will be to rely upon the press release itself of 2018, wherein they have said that 2A and 3B reconciliation is not necessary before filing of returns. So to my mind, based on these grounds, it's a very good case to say that no reversal is required. But practically what happens when we receive notices, if the amount is huge, say my mismatch report notice is of 70 lakh, 80 lakhs, 1 crore rupees, it's a good number, feasible to fight. I can take these grounds, fight. Sometimes because I'm registered in multiple states, I get small amount notices of 2 lakh rupees, 1 lakh rupees, where it is not feasible for me to fight. There, we will advise that whenever if you to decide to even reverse those credit without going into litigation route, always submit a protest letter to the department. Always submit a letter stating that there is a mismatch of rupees 2 lakh. In our view, no reversal is required because of these reasons, ground number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. However, to buy peace of mind, we are reversing under protest with the right to reclaim. So that in future, whenever there is a favorable judgment during this this relevant period, you can always take the benefit of reclaiming the credit. Friends, please note that there is no time limit attached to reclaim of credit. Why? Because this is based on the jurisprudence already settled in excise regime. In excise 57G, rule 57G, you wish to have a time limit. There the question arose whether reclaim time limit is also applicable in case of reclaim of credit, to which the Aurobindo Pharma Tribunal in case of Aurobindo Pharma or the Calcutta High Court or 2014 circular clearly held that no time limit is applicable in case of reclaim, for the reason that reclaim is only a reversal of the nullifying the original reversal entry. You are not claiming it fresh, hence time limit not applicable. When we talk about the period post 9 October 2019, when Rule 36(4) was introduced, to my mind, all the points which we have considered now, which we have discussed till now, will be applicable even for the period post this. Apart from that, an additional ground which we all have to take is to challenge the Rule 36(4), stating that this is going beyond the Act. There is no correspondingly condition in the Act. So existence of an enabling section in the statute for the purpose of making rule is necessary, which is absent in case of Rule 36(4), and that should be my ground. And in fact, various cases are pending before various High Court on this similar issue. So the stand which we have taken for the period prior to 9 October 2019 will be applicable even for the post period. And to collaborate this, in fact, government itself have realized that there is no such condition of the invoice being uploaded by the supplier on portal and being reflected by the recipient. And that's why they have imposed this condition in the Act. They have proposed in this for budget 2021 to amend section 16, wherein they are adding an additional condition. So as of now, what was the condition? I should be in a possession of a tax invoice. Yes, I'm in a possession of tax invoice. I should have received the goods and services. I have received the goods and services. The tax charge in respect of such supply has been actually paid to the government. We have already discussed this, that this provision cannot be implemented in the absence of all GSTR 2-3 forms, hence condition not applicable. I have furnished the return. Now that condition which was being imposed by Rule 36(4), or practically by virtue of which department is issuing notices of 2A3B mismatch, nowhere it was mentioned in the section. And now in the section they have specifically proposed is that the details of the invoice or debit note referred to in clause A has been furnished by the supplier in outward supply, and such details have been communicated to the recipient of such invoice or debit note in the manner specified under section 37. So it itself proved that this condition is being added for the first time. And in fact, we must note that there is no specific mention of this condition being retrospective in the budget amendment. In this budget, there are other amendments which they have been introduced with retrospective effect. So it has to be from prospective effect. So till the time this budget amendment becomes effective, all the grounds which we have discussed, we can always take. To my mind, it's a very, very good case to argue that no reversal is required. However, but we doesn't advise that you don't do reconciliation. You have to do reconciliations on regular basis. That is the intent of the department. We have to take it very, very serious, because what government want is that I will give credit only if supplier deposits the tax. That should be my approach. But where there is a litigation issue, we can fight basis these grounds. With this, now we will move on to the next case study. Over to you, Preetham.
So with regard to the next case study, with regard to parallel proceedings under GST law. So presently, friends, as a professionals, we have witnessed various notices being issued by various departments on the same subject matter. To analyze the same, let us understand who all can issue the notices under GST. So department, when we talk about under GST, has been broadly categorized under two subsets. The first subset is jurisdiction-based department. The second subset is intelligence-based. So when we talk about jurisdiction-based, so there is a center department, there is a state level department. When we talk about the intelligence-based department, we have NT-Vision from state and DGGST from center. Now to analyze the legal background, who can issue, who can initiate the proceedings under GST, let us read section 6 to subsection B. So what does it state? It states where a proper officer under state's GST Act or UTGST Act has initiated any proceedings on a subject matter, no proceedings shall be initiated by the proper officer under this Act on the same subject matter. Thereby meaning, in case an officer of the state has initiated the proceedings on any subject matter such as 283B reversals, in that case, any officer under CGST Act cannot initiate the proceedings under the same subject matter. So when we see this section, the cross empowerment with regard to center and the state has been clearly defined, but there is still ambiguity coming into with regard to jurisdiction based department as well as intelligence based department. So in case state has issued the notice, can GST issue the notice or not? To analyze the same, let us see some of the jurisprudence laid down under the GST regime. The first jurisprudence when we talk about is with regard to RCI India. So RCI India, in RCI India, Honorable High Court analyzed the concepts of cross empowerment. In the said case, the notices was already issued by the state GST authorities. But later on the same subject matter, Central GST Department also issued the notices. What this judicial precedent laid down is that once the state has already initiated the proceedings, the center cannot initiate the proceedings on the subject matter, relying upon another judgment in the name of Bhavani Textiles. When we talk about in this case, Honorable DGGI has already issued the notices and summon was also issued. But in addition to that, DGGI Surat has further initiated the proceedings. So the Honorable High Court in the case of Bhavani Textiles clearly stated that simultaneous initiation of enforcement action by the different authorities and on the same subject matter is quashable. So hence the initiating of the proceedings by DGGI Surat was considered bad in law. So these are some of the favorable cases. Now, with regard to the negative judgments, negative jurisprudence, in case of Daichini Iron and Steel Private Limited, the facts was such that the notices with regard to the fake invoices was issued by the state GST and even the SCN was framed. But subsequently, DGGST conducted the raid on the assessee and found investigation that the magnitude of the offense was far more grave and serious. So when we talk about the Chhattisgarh High Court judgment, they clearly distincted between the proceedings drawn for demand of tax evaded by assessee and raid conducted by DGGST. So hence, they gave the rulings in favor of DGGST, thereby enabling the search and seizures, the raid cases. There another ruling when we talk about JK Trading Company. In this case, the state GST was already has initiated the proceedings, but subsequently CGST has issued summon under section 70 for the purpose of inquiry. So what the court has held is that even in case of a cross empowerment, in case the same subject matter is being pending at SGST department, CGST in case have issued the summon or has initiated the inquiry, the court have held to be valid. But when we talk about the concept of summon, the concept of inquiry ultimately will lead to proceedings only. Inquiry when conducted will ultimately lead into initiating of proceedings, will ultimately lead into issuance of SCN only. So when we talk about to analyze this pronouncement, the word inquiry has not been interpreted properly. So keeping in mind the various overlapping judicial views, in case taxpayer faces such a situation where they have been received or they have been issued multiple notices from various jurisdiction on the same subject matter, we as a taxpayer, as a tax professional, should always give our submission in a humble manner, giving reference to section 6 subsection 2 subsection B. If still officer is not dropping the case, only recourse available to us is to either knock the doors of High Court or to cooperate with the officers in closing the proceedings. Over to you, Gitika, for the next case.
Thank you, Peetam. After explaining how the officers are having dual powers and how there's a parallel litigation which is going on between different officers, let's move on to see how to handle the summons under GST. J.K. Mittal sir has very aptly put in that, these days there are certain guidelines, there are certain laid down procedures given by the authorities. Still, there is some activities which are done at a practical level, at a ground level, due to which all the taxpayers are facing a huge hardship. So we'll see what is this summon proceedings all about. We all know about summon, what does it mean? But just to see how strictly and how aptly it is worded in the GST law. So summon proceeding, as the name suggests, it's a legal proceeding which gives the power to the GST officers to call upon anyone and present any evidence or document whatsoever is required for the purpose of any proceeding which is going on. So the provisions relating to summon have been laid down under Section 70 of the CGST Act. We'll break it down into pieces and understand each and every part of this provision to see what is it that the provision is laying down and how, as a taxpayer, we can react to such provisions, to such summons. So first requirement is that the proper officer under this act shall have power to summon any person. So we'll see what is the proper officer. Proper officer for the purpose of issuing summon have been defined, have been explained under the circular to be even the officer at a superintendent level. Even any superior officer can exercise these powers, so these can issue these summons who have been given the powers under Section 5(2) of the Act. Point to be noted over here is that the superintendent of audit division cannot issue you the summon. Only your jurisdictional officers can issue you summon. And they also have some powers of extended jurisdiction, which goes up to 200 kilometers from their jurisdiction. So superintendent or any officer superior to them can issue you summon, but any superintendent from an audit division cannot issue you summon. Now, there is another wing which we saw, Peetam had mentioned about their different officers. One of them is the intelligence wing, which is the DGGI. These officers, they have an all India jurisdiction. So you cannot go and complain that I am sitting in Delhi and DGGI of Maharashtra is summoning me for any matter. That will not be entertained. In other cases, in where officers who are not of your jurisdiction, if they summon you, you can always challenge, and at least you can reply if you don't want to straight away challenge that, sir, you don't belong to my jurisdiction. I request you to pass on the matter to my jurisdiction officer and I'll go and meet him. But in case of DGGI, because these are intelligence officers, wide powers have been given to them. And they are all India jurisdiction. They have been given to call people from all India. So you have to be very careful who is issuing summon to you and what powers do they have. Whether you can challenge those summons or you can rebut those summons by not attending to them is something you have to be very careful about. Now, going back to the main section. It says that the officers can ask the attendance of any person whom he considers necessary. So if you see, the word which is used over here is not having a reason to believe, like in the case of arrest and other prosecution or maybe other proceedings. In this case, the powers have been so widely given that if the officer feels necessary, he doesn't have any specific reason also. Even on the basis of suspicion, he can call anyone. And CBIC guidelines also clearly mention that any person who has been summoned is legally bound to attend them. And just a minute, if we can remain on the first line. Yeah, they have to attend them personally or through their authorized representative. And also, because these summons are treated as judicial proceedings, there's a specific subsection under Section 70, which says that if you can, yeah, any inquiry which is being conducted under subsection 1 is to be deemed as a judicial proceedings, and they have a linkage with the Indian Penal Code, which talks about Section 190, applicability of Section 193 and 228 of Indian Penal Code, which talks about giving the false evidence and if you are interrupting any proceedings of the the officer who is summoning you. Apart from the consequences which are given under this section, in general, there are certain other consequences which may happen on non-appearance, which are under Indian Penal Code is if you don't appear for someone without any justifiable reason, So there could be a reason if you are not well, if you are traveling, or you cannot be available. Like today, there are lockdown situation. These are all justifiable reasons where you can ask the officer that we cannot appear, and if it's a formal, cordial behavior, they will also give you another date for appearing. But if there is no reasonable justification and you don't appear or you don't give any reasons for non-appearance, then there's a prosecution under Indian Penal Code for 1 month of imprisonment along with the fine. Likewise, if you are absconding to avoid any summons, again, there's a prosecution under section 172 of IPC, which is imprisonment for 1 month and fine. And the last thing, if you don't produce the relevant documents which is sought for, there's a imprisonment of 1 month under section 175. So going back to the requirement of the section, the person who is required has to come either to give an evidence. When they say evidence, it's mostly like a statement, coming and presenting yourself and giving the statement of the facts which the officers are asking, or produce any document which are relevant for the inquiry. Now, friends, what is going to be important for us to analyze over here is there are 3 important aspects relating to giving these statements. So giving documents on all is something which is a routine matter. We keep on, corresponding with the document and the officers. We give them documents, etc., which is a normal undertaken under the normal course of business. What is more important is the relevance of the statement that you are giving. Very important that whatever statements you are giving in front of officer, please note this is going to be the basis of the allegations or the grounds that they're going to frame against you. So you have to be very careful what you're going. What you have to speak is only the truth of facts. No false evidence to be given, because it will backfire on you, and we have seen there is a prosecution under IPC. Now, second important thing which comes into discussion is that whether the statements which are given before the GST officers, are these admissible as evidence or not? Friends, for this, we'll quickly refer to section 25 and 26 of Indian Evidence Act. Now, this section is specifically made keeping in mind the evidences or the confession which are made before the police officers. So in one of the cases of Ramesh Chandra and Mehta, the assessee argued that any confession which is made before the police officer is inadmissible. Point to be noted over here that GST officers have been given the powers of police, which is given to them under CRPC, the Criminal Code Procedure. So the assessee argued that since they are like a police officer, and section 25 and 26 of Indian Evidence Act specifically say that the confession before the police officer is not admissible, hence any statement made by me before the customs officer should also not be admissible as an evidence. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court held otherwise. They said that while the customs officers have been given the power of the police officer, they are not the police officers. They also looked into the intent of making section 25 and 26, that in general, we all know as a public and general public that police officers, they tend to be harsh, coercive. They can also go to an extent of harassment so as to get the confession from the accused, which is not so-called accused, but they consider them as an accused. So they said the customs officers are not of that kind. They don't, adopt such a degree of harassment or strictness with the assessees. You just have to go and present your facts, and they will, take up the matter as per the submissions made by you. So while at the ground level, we have seen that the DGGI officers, DRI officers have been harsh and harassed the people at the ground level. Since still, the courts held that since the officers, they don't technically qualify as a police officer, any evidence which has been made by them before the customs officer will be inadmissible evidence. Here, I would like to just highlight few guidelines which have been given by the CBIC, which J.K. Mittal sir has, touched upon in the introduction part also. There are detailed guidelines which have been given to the officers, how they should behave during the summons and what is the methodology they should adopt. One of them being the summons should not be just given like any other notice. This should only be resorted as the last resort, only when the people are not cooperating. So this is the last piece of, weapon which is given to them, that you can have a normal correspondence, ask them to give the details. If the assessee is cooperating, then there is no need to issue summon. So only where the people are not cooperating, then summon is the last resort. Unfortunately, we have seen at the ground level, the summons are being issued left, right, center to the assessees without even asking them for the prior information or any prior documentation, or where they can prove that they have not cooperated and therefore the summons were issued. Secondly, just on that point only, Secondly, issuing summons to the top management, etc. There also the guidelines are very clear that you need not call the top management for every situation or on the face of it. Only when you have a belief that the crime or the offense or the non-compliance that has happened, that was done with the decision or in their knowledge, and they were the party to making decision because of which this non-compliance has happened. Only then they should be called upon for presenting in person. Otherwise, in the first instance, the top management should not be called upon. Lastly, and very important part, which even sir highlighted, was that summons should be issued during the office hours. So what we have seen is that the statements are coercively taken from the assessees, the taxpayers, and how it is done as a practice is that in the initial part of the day, the questions are framed, same questions are asked from here and there, reframed, etc. And the taxpayers are forced to sit even after office hours. So this somewhere down the line creates a pressure in their mind. By the time the day ends, they are not in the right state of mind. And that's where these officers, they pressurize, they coercively take the statements of the assessees, the taxpayers, and record it in their notice. Point to be noted, whatever the statements are recorded by the GST officers are also given, the copy of the same is also given to you. They get it signed also, so that it's an acknowledgement that you have given the statement. Now we have seen that the way these statements are taken, it's under so much of pressure that sometimes the taxpayers, they break down. They're not in right state of mind. There are so many harassment cases, like sir also mentioned, that the assessees are being harassed. We saw a lot of cases in Gujarat where traders tried to commit suicide, and that's where the High Court come into picture and they ask the officers not to harass. But unfortunately, at ground level, the officers are still adopting the same practice and they are not changing their ways of doing things. So what to do at this stage? If by such a coercive action, any statements has been forcibly taken by the officers from the taxpayers, now is the time you need to know your rights as a taxpayer. What is it that you can do to save yourself from getting any allegation against you? Because the kind of statement which was taken at that point of time, it was not given at that state of mind in which you could have rendered a right statement. So here comes into play is the law of retraction. What is it that you can do over here is that you can simply write a mail once you get the copy of the statement. You can simply write an email to the officer, rephrasing or correcting those statements which are according to you incorrect. The only point that we would like to make over here is that please don't be harsh to them when you're writing mails. Don't use any abusive language or any harsh language. Be polite with them. A simple polite mail mentioning that, look, this is the statement which was recorded and has been incorrectly stated in the facts. I would write it to be read in this way, and then you present the correct statement and put it on your records. So that tomorrow the officers cannot come and say that this is the statement you made. You never said that the statement was wrong or incorrectly placed, and therefore we are taking this as a grounds against you. So this is one right which you will have in case under pressure you have given any evidence or any statement which you were not supposed to give. Now, while giving the statement, there is another principle is that you have a right to keep silent. So there would be times that the officers would force you to speak and give some statements. So please note, this is another right that you as a taxpayer, as an Indian citizen, you have, is that no person can be compelled to be a witness against him, and no one can be bound to answer any question which can expose him to any criminal charge. There are umpteen judgments at the Supreme Court level and a High Court level where it has been held that remaining silent is not an offense. So wherever you don't know any fact, you're not sure about any fact, please don't give any evidence or any statement. You can simply say that you are not aware of it, and maybe some other person who's more knowledgeable about the fact can give you the correct statement. So this is one way of protecting yourself from giving any false statement, because tomorrow only two things can happen. If the false statement can either lead you in jail, or it can also be a ground for issuing a show cause notice against you. And of course, the following prosecutions and penal provisions will follow. Another important thing which always is asked is that whether during the summons, any CA or any advocate or lawyer can accompany the SSC. Friends, there is no written law anywhere in the GST law. Nowhere it is clearly mentioned whether this is allowed or not allowed. But in past, we have seen in various cases, the courts are divided. In some cases, they have allowed, in some cases, they haven't allowed. So you can only request the officer, and he has all the discretion to accept or deny your request. If your request is denied, you can also go and approach the High Court and take the relief from there. But there is a Supreme Court ruling in the case of Poolpandi where they have clearly mentioned that since the accused which is called for the inquiry, or the taxpayer who is called for the inquiry, is not an accused. So once, till the time he has been proven accused, he is not required to have any legal representative to represent him in front of officer. Till that time, he's just a person who's being called for seeking facts, and he can just simply go on his own and give the facts of the transaction and come back. Now, the last thing which we have experienced and seen in practice is that officers, they try to apply this tactic of presenting a fact with someone else's name. So you are being examined and they will tell you your boss, your colleague, your junior, or your service provider or a business partner has given this statement. So why are you not conceding to it? Please don't concede to anything that you don't agree to or you're not sure about, even if such statements or such references are being made. Here, again, you have the right to cross-examine the other person whose name is being taken up. You can ask the officer that you would want that person to be present and present the statement in front of him. And you can always cross-examine the statements that he has made. Therefore, these are the rights which you need to keep in mind. So just keep your calm, keep cool, and don't be, harsh with the officer. What is going to help you at this stage is only your cordial relationship with the officers. And if things are normal and they are not, you have not done any malafide, then things will also pass by. So keeping this in mind, I'll just pass on the next topic to Tushar, and he can take it up from there.
Thanks, Gitika. The next issue which we will be discussing is how to handle the notices which I, as a bona fide buyer, is receiving on account of fake invoice, fake supplier issues. So what is the issue really about? So we have a limited time, so we cannot cover the entire topic in detail. So I will have taken a specific case study to discuss. Practically what happens, we have two kinds of suppliers. One is a supplier who's actually a fake supplier, a supplier on books only and not in reality. However, there is a second type of supplier who is actually a supplier who has supplied goods to you. You have purchased goods from him. But that particular supplier, what he has done, because of whatever reason, say he has issued some fake billing to third parties to increase his turnover, maybe for loan purpose, etc., or he has done some purchases to reduce his profit. So you are a genuine buyer, you have purchased from a genuine supplier. That particular supplier has done something wrong. He has issued invoices, fake invoices to third parties also to influence some of that turnover. He has purchased bills from some outside parties. So in such situation, what the department is doing at ground level and what we have been facing in last couple of months is that department is issuing notices to all the buyer of the supplier. This particular supplier, they will issue notices to all the buyers stating that your purchases are bogus, please reverse the credit. Whereas I, being a genuine purchaser, I have actually purchased. He has done some fake billing to the third party, because of which I am also getting punished. And why department is doing? Because they don't have evidence who is the fake buyer and who is the genuine buyer, because that particular supplier is supplying to both. So they are issuing notices to 100%. In fact, DGI is issuing advisory to 100% buyers, etc. So in these cases, whenever I, as a bona fide buyer, I receive such notices, how do I reply that? It is very important to note that under section 155, it is the onus on the taxpayer to prove that he has satisfied all the conditions under section 16. So whenever I make a reply, I have to generally prove that I have made the purchases for these goods under these invoices, and I have satisfied all the conditions for availment of credit. Namely, that I have a valid tax invoice. Second, a very important condition, that I've actually received the goods and services, that the goods have been received by me. This is the correspondingly e-invoice. This is the copy of the e-way bill. This is the entry in my GR register or the IR register, whatever I maintain in the gate. So whatever is the documentation, you just write in the reply that these all are the documentations available with me, which specifically prove that I have received the invoices. And then the remaining conditions, how I have satisfied all those conditions. So I have to put each and every condition and write how I am satisfying each and every condition. And hence it's a bona fide purchase. And I have legally entitled to take all the credit. That should be your ground, which should be always captured in the reply, which you will submit against such notices. Second is past jurisprudence. You can take reference of various past jurisprudence wherein they are specifically held that if my sales are genuine, if as a taxpayer my sales are genuine, if my sales are genuine, then I must have manufactured or purchased the goods. So how can I make a genuine sale? If you are saying that my purchases are bogus, that supplier has given me a fake bill and my purchases are bogus, then how can I actually manufacture in reality and sell the goods to the genuine buyers? So the second ground which we should always take in such cases is to prove and rely upon all judgments, give our consumption pattern, production pattern, and prove that I have used these goods to manufacture so much of quantity of manufactured goods which I have sold to so many genuine buyers, etc. All my sales are genuine. Please note, for alleging that the notice has availed input tax credit on supplies received from a non-existing supplier, the department has to show from where the noticee has purchased the requisite raw material for effecting its genuine outward supply. Merely just by issuing notices that it's a bogus supplier, etc., my credit cannot get reversed. They don't have proof. So it was my genuine purchase. They don't have a proof of my any alternate purchase basis which I have manufactured the goods. So this ground itself is sufficient to win all such kinds of notices. Another important thing is in such kind of notices, sometimes they say that this particular statement, they rely upon the statement of certain particular person, etc., stating that he has given a confession that it's a fake invoice, etc. That itself is not sufficient. That itself is not sufficient. You have a right of cross-examination, at what we discussed in summons also. So you always have a right to cross-examine that particular person whose statement has been relied by the department in issuing the notices, etc. And mind you, cross-examination is an art. We have practically seen that in cross-examination, all the statements gets reversed. There are so many new developments, and in fact, there are cases wherein the authority deny you the right of cross-examination, and on this basis itself, the cases are won. It is a well-established principle that it is a fundamental right of the taxpayer to ask for cross-examination of the witness whose statement have been relied upon by the authorities. Apart from that, there are other grounds like the show cause notice should not be vague, all the allegations should be properly captured and replied, the jurisdiction, the monetary limit part should be addressed, whether the right person has issued, whether he is the proper officer or not, replies to interest and penal provisions. So what we want to emphasize on these cases is that we should not get tensed when we receive such kind of notices. This is a practice being followed by the developer. I as a bona fide buyer simply need to reply to them stating that my purchases are genuine, my section 16 all conditions are getting satisfied. I've used these goods to manufacture my final product which are being sold to the genuine buyers, etc. So there is no reversal which is required. And in fact, whatever proceedings are being going on in India, it's only the allegations by the department and nothing has come to a conclusion. No order has been passed. When these cases will actually come at Commissioner Appeal Tribunal, High Court level, there we will see that basis these grounds itself, we will find lots of favorable and judgments in our favor. In excise regime also, all these grounds, whatever we have discussed, basis these grounds itself, the taxpayers have obtained a favorable judgment. So we have to keep all these grounds in mind, always reply to a letter. And sometimes what happens because of under protest, even we have to reverse the credit, etc., reverse under protest. Always write a letter stating that basis these reasons, my credit is not required to be reversed. Just to buy peace of mind, I'm reversing under protest with the right to reclaim and with the right to appeal against it. With this, we will now move to our next case study. Over to you, Peter.
So with next case study relates to taxabilities of cross charge and how cross charge is different from ISD. What is the distincting factor with vis-a-vis cross charge and ISD? When we talk about the word cross charge, friends, cross charge has not been defined anywhere in the Act. What is the basis, how this word has been derived upon? When we talk about supply has been defined in section 7, which is with consideration. And when we see Schedule 1, that is the transaction without consideration, which will be treated as supply. If we see the clause, supply of goods or services or both between related party or between the distinct person as specified in section 25, when made in the course or furtherance of business, shall also be treated as supply, even in case it is made without consideration. So just to illustrate it, I am taking an example. Suppose I am having an head office in the state of Delhi and I am having two manufacturing plants, one in the state of Baddi and one in the state of Maharashtra. So in case there is a movement of goods from Baddi to Maharashtra, definitely that is a supply of goods and which has to be, the tax has to be paid thereupon with regard to the Schedule 1. In case as an head office in Delhi, I am providing marketing and the business support services to both these manufacturing plant. So same principles when we draw with regard to movement of goods. As a head office, I am providing services. There is a supply of services in the form of business support as well as marketing to both these manufacturing units. So what should be the basis? How I need to value these services is something which we need to understand with regard to the cross-charge concept. So when we see the valuation principles, Rule 28, the second proviso. What does the second proviso state is that in case my recipient is eligible to full ITC, the value declared in the invoice shall be deemed to be the open market value of the goods or services which I have supplied. So in case my manufacturing unit is manufacturing only taxable products and they are supplying only taxable products and where they are eligible for 100% credit, then any value which I am showing in my invoice with regard to my marketing, with regard to my business support services from HO to these manufacturing plants will be deemed to be the open market value. But when we talk about that these manufacturing plant was dealing into exempted goods as well as taxable goods, what should be my value of the cross charge? When we talk about such a scenario where my manufacturing plant was manufacturing taxable goods as well as exempted goods, they are not eligible with regard to 100% credit because Rule 42 applies. So in such a case, as a taxpayer, as a HO, I need to go to Rule 30, wherein I need to compute my cost of services and I need to add a margin of 10%. That is total of 110% on the cost, and that is something which I need to cross charge. As a taxpayer, we definitely need to have an agreement in place with the head office as well as with these manufacturing units or the marketing units, marketing place, wherein we can define the tenure, wherein we can define at what interval the HO shall raise the invoices with regard to their business support services. Now coming to the ISD provisions, friends. ISD provisions are not new under GST law. So ISD provisions have taken its basis from earlier excise regime. Under excise regime, the ISD concept was very much evident, wherein any invoices which was processed at the HO but ultimately was consumed in any other state was passed through an ISD number, was passed through the ISD provisions under excise law. So when we talk about the ISD provisions under GST, ISD provisions under GST are also not new. They have been borrowed from excise law. So what does this ISD provision talk about is that in case the services or the goods, in case the services are not consumed and it has been consumed by the other states, in that case, for the easiness of making the payment for the bill processing, the HO or any other location may take an ISD number and make the processing from there and later on distribute the credit to the respective GSTN on the basis of the formula as derived under section with regard to the turnover. So when we talk about the distinction, what is the main distinction between the concept of cross charge and the ISD is the concept of consumption. In case any services have been consumed in the state of HO only, that services we cannot pass through in the form of ISD, that has to be cross charge only. In case some of the services have been consumed in under different location to any other location, in that case we can pass on that bill through, we can route that bill through the ISD provisions. Just to illustrate it, in case we see the audit services are being done for all the locations. These services are not being consumed at the HO level itself, rather these are being consumed at all the respective location. Audit services is something which can be passed through the ISD provision. If we see rental, if we see maintenance, if we see the depreciation of assets at HO, these three together, these are actually being consumed in the state of head office only. So in case these are consumed for providing the business support services, the cost for these should be allocated as per Rule 30 or proviso to Rule 28 and should be allocated in the form of cross charge. There is ambiguity with regard to salary cost, whether salary cost has to be included in the under cross charge or not. The same is the case with advertisement. Advertisement, when we talk about, has been consumed in all the other locations. So definitely it can be passed through in the form of IST. So with this, we are coming to the last topic of today. Over to you, Gitika, for taking the taxability of discount schemes.
Okay, the last one, but I think still the interesting topic for the industry. What are the taxability on the various discount schemes? So this is something which is very, very germane to any FMCG or a pharma sector, where we have three layers of player in the entire transaction. One is the manufacturer, the other one is the distributor, and the third one is the retailer. So there are a lot of arrangements which keep on happening between the manufacturer, distributor, retailer, and so forth. So this is something which is not an issue, which is, hello? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, ma'am, continue.
Sorry. So this is something which is not a new issue, which is for the first time coming in GST. This has always been an issue even in the pre-GST law. But let's see to what extent the GST has clarified it or still the ambiguity remains. What we'll do is we'll pick up 5 major important transactions which happen in this particular sector. One is the type of discount which is very commonly known as the target based or the volume based discount. So this discount is something which is based on the purchases which are made by the distributor from the manufacturer. Say for example, if you purchase so and so unit, then I'll give you additional discount of so much on the purchases. Similar to this is a different discount. Similar to this discount, there is another level type of discount, but this is calculated not on the purchases of the distributor from the manufacturer, but this is calculated on the sales that the distributor makes to the retailer. So here also there is some target, some volume base, which is decided that if you sell so many units to your retailer, then I will give you so many such and such an additional discount. So if you say the first and second are more or less same kind of a discount, which are dependent on targets, one is on the purchase side and one is on the sales side. Third category comes where due to the competitive market, which is where we are all working in, the distributor is asked to sell the goods to the retailer at a lower price, and whatever the differential amount be, that will be reimbursed by the manufacturer to the distributor to reinstate him to the cost that he has incurred in purchasing. Then there is another category where you sell specifically to corporate customers, you get additional discount. Another category is that if you are organizing some event or you place my product in such and such strategic location so that my product gets the more visibility, commonly known as a visibility bonus. So there is a lot of discussion and ambiguity around that, what qualifies as discount, what doesn't qualify as discount, and why is this coming as an issue is that of late we have seen that the authorities, whether at your jurisdictional level or at intelligence level, they have started sending notices to the people in the sector and asking them to pay the taxes, whatever they have shown, whether as discount or as any other amount in their books, and asking them to pay the taxes. So before we go into the answering the question that what qualifies a discount out of these 5 and what doesn't qualify as a discount, just to quickly recapitulate, section 15(3)(a), which is the valuation section, it talks about the discounts which are given on invoice. Very clearly, it mentions that any amount which you are giving on your invoice is a discount, and therefore there is no ambiguity around it. Comes the second part of it, 15(3)(b), which talks about the post-supply discount. So like we saw that there are certain situations which are dependent on the supplies which are made. So there also the law has given some relief to the taxpayers, giving the clarity that if you are getting anything as a post-supply discount, we will consider this as a discount and reduce it from the value only if such discount can be established from the terms of agreement, that before entering into agreement or at the time of the agreement, this discount was known. And secondly, no input tax credit has been taken with respect to this amount if this is given at a later stage, whether by way of credit note or any other document. Now we'll move on to answer the questions or the situations which we have seen. The case study 1 which we saw, which is a discount based on the purchase. So in this case, as the section 15(3)(a) clearly says that when you are making a purchase, this is very clearly available that so and so purchase is given. If it is not available at that point of time, let's say upfront you have given some purchase discount, but then there could be situation that you fall under certain slab. So then this will fall under 15(3)(b) situation as a post supply discount. Now here the conditions are clearly met. Why? Because at the time of entering agreement, you have agreed upon with your distributor that if you achieve so and so target, I will give you so and so discount. Now the question comes that at the time of purchase, the distributor has paid the full amount. How this discount can be passed on? What should be the document? Section 34 is a very specific section which talks about a situation where you can issue credit note. This situation will also consider the situation of discount, and where the manufacturers, they want to pass on this discount to the distributors down the line, they can issue the credit note. In the industry, we have seen both the practices are prevalent, whether it is with GST or without GST. With GST, it will be section 34 credit note, and without GST, it becomes the commercial credit note. Since there is no tax implication, any kind of a situation or a approach adopted by the assessee would be feasible. Wherever there is a GST credit note, the input tax reversal is required. Otherwise, there is no need for reversal. Coming to the next case study. Now, this is the study. This is a case where the discount is not based on the purchases of the distributor, but on the sales which are made by the distributor to the retailer. Friends, just wanted to highlight that this kind of a situation, like I said, this is not for the first time that these transactions are being undertaken under GST. This was also prevalent under pre-GST law, under the excise and service tax regime. So if you see technically what happens over here is that whatever the sales the distributor is making down the line to the retailers, this will indirectly induce the purchases of the distributor. So we feel, and according to us, case 1 and case 2 are of the similar nature. Even if they are post-supply discounts, they qualify for the discount so long as the agreement is in place and it's clearly mentioning that what is the level of discount which will be given. Looking back at the pre-GST regime, there have been judgments in case of Sai Service Station, Shaurya Motors, Satnam Auto and all, where the demand was raised in case of these transactions on the grounds that the distributor is providing the promotional marketing and the business auxiliary kind of a services. Here the courts very clearly mentioned that whatever the incentives they are receiving from the distributors, it doesn't qualify under this category, because in business auxiliary services, you were supposed to promote the goods of a third person. But the relationship between the manufacturer and the distributor is on P2P basis. When they are promoting the goods or whatever incentives they are getting it for their own sales. Now, if we see these judgments are specifically not discussed this kind of a criteria or commented upon that whether, these would qualify as a post-sale discount or whether they should be included in value and all, because the demand related to business auxiliary services. But like I said, our view is that case 1 and case 2 are good enough to qualify for the discount categorization as long as we have proper documents in place. Now coming to the case study 3 and 4. Now, this is a study where this is a case where goods are, like I said, the goods are sold to the distributor. But at a later stage, let's say, depending upon the competition in the market, or let's say, assuming there are some festival seasons, etc., going on, the distributors are asked to pass on some discount to the retailers, and then they get the differential reimbursed by the manufacturer. Now, the question comes whether these are post-supply discount or not. According to us, these don't qualify as post-supply discount for the simple reason they don't fit into the criteria of 15(3)(b). Because at the time of entering an agreement, they would have not contemplated that such a situation would arise in future. They would not have contemplated that what festival discounts or what seasonal discount they would want to give. So since those criteria are not met in, these would fail to qualify as discount. Then the next question comes is that whether the amount of the differential amount which the manufacturers have given to the distributors, can that be added to the value of the goods which are sold by the distributor to the retailer? For that, if you see the section 231 of the Act, which defines consideration, it says that the consideration shall inter alia include the payment made whether by the recipient or any other person. So this is a trigger point that because for the same goods, some amount is being collected by the distributor from retailer and some is collected from the manufacturer. Friends, in our view, this situation would come into play only when all three parties are privy to the contract. they know that a particular product is being given to them at a lower cost, and some part is being given to the supplier by manufacturer or some other person, which is typically seen in the case of subvention schemes. So in case this kind of a transaction does not exist, we can still argue to say that this is not a consideration which should be added to the value of the supply that is made by the distributor to the retailer. Then what should be the treatment of this amount which is coming out of the way in the hands of distributor? It doesn't qualify as discount. It doesn't qualify as the value of goods. What is the third category which is left? The third category which can be or which is normally being decided or concluded by the taxpayers and also by the authorities is that this is a separate service which is given by the distributor to the manufacturer. And we have a very specific clause 5E under Schedule 3, which talks about an agreeing to obligation to do an act. This was already a declared service under service tax regime. So this is one category where possibly this amount will get categorized, where the distributor agrees to sell to the goods to the retailer at a lower price, and for which he is being compensated by the manufacturer. So this doesn't qualify as a discount, but still is capable of being classified under these services. The last part, where the distributors, they organize any specific event, do any activity for manufacturer to promote their sales. Also, like we saw, that displaying their goods at a strategic location, putting some promotional campaigns and all. This is all something will again qualify as a service which is being provided by the distributor to the manufacturer. And it would be very difficult to argue that these services can qualify as a post-supply discount, because there is no linkage with the sale to the customer, to the retailer, or purchases from the manufacturer. This standalone can be treated as a separate service. So if you see broadly in this segment, the transactions can either qualify as discount or they can qualify as service. There is no other third category where you can put these discounts and tax them. I think with this, we have ended the session. We can take up the question answers now.
Thank you very much. You can see that there are questions in the question answer box and as well as in the chat box. So few of the participants have raised directly to me, and I have already shared with Mr. Prashad as well as Mr. Pitam. So if you could respond to them.
Should I take the first question? The first question is from Purushottam Gopalanji. He says that there is a manufacturing unit and there are different locations, and all the multinational companies are having head office will pass book entries under accounting standard 32 to adjust the assets and liabilities instead of paying one unit to another unit located in different states. Do we actually need to make the payments within 180 days with regard to second proviso under section 16 subsection 2? When we talk about this case, generally speaking, the multinational company or the Indian industrialists generally have one or two bank accounts for the purpose of reconciliations, and all the proceeds of all sales proceeds and the accounts payable are being managed through those bank accounts only. So when we talk about passing of the book entries from one GSTN to another GSTN, definitely the same will be treated as if the payment has been made. This will be treated as a deeming friction of payment being made, which has been iterated in Hindustan Zinc also with regard to the retention money, where the retention money, if held, was also treated to be as payment being made under the service tax regime. So definitely with regard to the question, in case the company has passed on the book entry with regard to the payment, it will be treated as if the payment has been made, and it will be treated as if we have already complied with the second proviso to section 16 subsection 2.
So moving on to the next question, an interesting question. It says that under section 16.2, it stipulates that the goods should have been received. So what do you mean by the term received? Does it require physical receipt, or can the scope be interpreted to be wide to mean the instance of transfer of title as against physical receipt? It assumes significance mainly in cases of bulk purchases where you are purchasing imported consignments on bulks. For example, let me reframe his question. I have imported goods. I'm importing container of coal. That coal container will reach to me in various racks. So that racks will keep on moving for a couple of months, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. So as per the law, the way law is written, I should have received the goods. And then there is a specific proviso also wherein it is said that if the goods are received in lot, I should take the credit only on receipt of last lot. So what do you mean by received in this case? So to my mind, when we see the definition and when we see section 16, it only says that the goods should have been received. It does not say that the goods should have been received in the factory of the manufacturer or the factory of the taxpayer or the premises of the taxpayer. When we compare this with the excise law, under excise law, there was a specific provision wherein it was written under the definition of inputs that the goods should have been received in the factory, whereas in the factory or in the warehouse or in the premises, word is missing in this case. So in fact, even in excise regime, where the goods were used at captive mine, 100% captive mine, the courts have allowed credit, treating that 100% captive mine to be an extended part of your factory. So in my view, there is an argument possible to state that the receipt here has to be read as a constructive receipt. It has to be read as a constructive receipt and not actually physical receipt. So if I have got the title, I have got the effective possession, constructive possession, I should be able to take the credit. But obviously, this has to be tested in court of law, more so because of a specific provision which says that even if the goods are received in last lots, you have to take credit at the time of last lot. Given this kind of wordings in the Act, this proviso has to be, this interpretation has to be tested in court of law. But to my mind, it's a good way to argue that it can be a constructive receipt and not physical receipt. One another question which was raised was, can I route everything through cross charge instead of ISD or vice versa? Is it possible under the GST regime or not? My answer to this is that if we route everything, let me take two cases. If I decide to route everything through ISD and I'm not doing cross charge, in such a situation, please note, there are two problems attached to it. First, when I'm routing all services through ISD to other locations, what I'm effectively doing is a distribution of credit. So there is an HO of rental services. If I distribute it to the another manufacturing plants, so in that case, the issue can rise that this HO renting services has been consumed at Delhi only, and it is not used by those manufacturing plants in Jharkhand, etc., and it is not used in their business, hence credit denied. Second, cross charge is an independent provision. In any case, there is a supply of business support services by head office to the various plants located across India. So under Schedule 1, we are covered. So routing everything through ISD instead of cross charge may be a problem. But when we talk about vice versa, when I'm doing everything as a cross charge, I include everything in cross charge, all expenditure, including rental, etc., audit, advertisement, etc., and route it through cross charge. Practically, what I feel is that even we are routing everything through cross charge, etc., then it will be only a procedural mistake of not taking an ISD registration because there is no revenue loss to the government. Effectively, as the credit has gone to the recipient state, though government intention is clear that cross charge and ISD are two different concepts. In fact, they had come out with a very beautiful draft circular, but that was only a draft and never came up and was taken back. But the reasoning given in that circular, which actually explained that cross charge and ISD are two alternative provisions and should not be read together, is an important circular which we all should keep in mind.
With regard to another question, what is the position for applying Rule 28 for cross-charge valuation from HO to its two plants? One is a manufacturing taxable plant and another one is the non-taxable plant. Whether by cross-charge invoice, higher allocation can be made to the taxable goods manufacturing unit. To answer this, as we have discussed with regard to Rule 28, in case where the recipient is not able to avail 100% credit, then we need to make cost plus 10% margin. So in such a case, there should be a reasonable basis over which the cross charge has to be made upon. In case I am having two plants and I am having only 10% taxable supplies and 90% turnover is coming from non-taxable supplies, it cannot be substituted in such a way that I am charging a higher allocation to the taxable unit only for the purpose of availing the credit. Wherein the case is such that I am actually providing the services to the plant which is providing non-taxable goods. So there should be the reasonable basis for the purpose of providing the cross charge, and the reasonable basis could be, one of the reasonable basis could be the turnover on the basis of which I am cross charging my cost.
Another issue, interesting issue which is being raised is before issuing the GST credit note, Is it my onus? Is it the onus of the supplier to ensure that the buyer has reversed the ITC? So under section 34, it says that whenever I'm issuing a GST credit note, I can get the benefit of the GST adjustment in my returns. But the condition attached to it is that the recipient should have reversed the credit. Friends, please note, when this section was introduced, at that time, we had a specific provision under section 42 and 43 for matching of credit notes concept also. What was contemplated at that time when this provision was put in the GST law was that the supplier would issue a GST credit note in GSTR1, which will get auto-populated to the recipient in GSTR2. He will accept and his credit will automatically get reduced. Now, there is no mechanism for you to check whether he has reversed the credit or not, except otherwise taking an undertaking from him. So what we practically feel and advise is that considering that the entire technical system is on hold because of GSTR 2 and 3, this cannot be implemented through system at ground level. So what you can do is that whenever you issue a GST credit note, just write a declaration on that the credit on this GST credit note has to be reversed by the recipient. And if feasible, try to take an undertaking from them. Say if for example, you are issuing to the distributors. So you can just take a general undertaking because your distributor will be fixed. Say 50 numbers, 100 numbers, 200 numbers, that they are reversing credit on whatever GST credit note has been issued. So that is a conservative approach. Legally, if you have not taken such undertaking, tomorrow department dispute, to my mind, it's a good case to argue that onus is not on you because law cannot compel you to do something which is impossible in the absence of technical system, GST system, providing you the facility to check whether he has reversed the credit or not, which was originally contemplated at the time of GST 123. This cannot be enforced as of now.
I'll take up the next one. How do you see Canon India judgment and its impact on Pan India Power DGGST? So, see, in the case of Canon India, what happened was that the High Court has quashed the powers basis. The notification under which the powers were given, they itself were defunct. So the powers were supposed to be given under Section 6, but the powers were given under Section 2 of the Act. So keeping that in mind and considering the High Court position, the authorities have stayed the issuance of any notice by the DGGI. But we expect the authorities to go against this judgment, and they will definitely go for an appeal, and the matters may go against the taxpayers. So they may still have the Pan India powers.
Just to add what Geetika has said, basically it is the DRI who has been ordered not to issue any show cause notices. But when we see the impact of that judgment in GST regime, whether that judgment can be taken in GST regime or not, so we have to analyze whether the DGGI is a proper officer under the GST regime or not. When we see Section 291 of the GST Act, read with the notification 14/2017, which was issued for the DGGI, etc. So that is something which has to be contemplated, has to be tested under the GST regime, to what extent that judgment will be used in GST. But again, I would like to draw up one point here. When this Section 14/2017 notification was issued, wherein the power was given to the DGGI, earlier it was issued by the CBIC, and later on they amended in 2019 to make it retrospective and issued a corrigendum that it is not being issued by the CBIC but the central government. They issued a corrigendum. So to my mind, at least for the period prior to 2019, it's a good case stating that at that time the notification which was issued was by the CBIC and not the central government, and corrigendum has to be read prospectively, not retrospectively, and they were not the officer during that particular period of time. But after that period, it is something which still has to be analyzed and seen how the impact of this case will be there. Sir, I would request J.K. Mittal sir on this issue if he can throw his light, because I have listened to him and he's one of the best authority to speak on this.
Yes, thank you so much. And my point is that, Mr. Tushar, that DGGI, like the DRAI, is a different authority. What the Supreme Court has said in this case, once the jurisdictional officer has already exercised his power, then the different department cannot exercise that power. Therefore, what is happening in the GST also, jurisdictional officer is exercising his power. Thereafter, DGGI comes and they exercise the power for the same assessment, same period. So in that context, this judgment will be squarely applicable.
So the principle of commodity will be squarely applicable.
Yes, and that Justice Muralidharan also said long back in Delhi High Court in the similar issue, because once the jurisdiction is by the dual authority, who exercise the first, that will be the real authority, not the subsequent authority. Therefore, and secondly, this judgment is of the Supreme Court. Probably what I heard from Geetika, is probably under the impression that
Mr. Supreme Court, I think it was a mistake. slip of pen.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your valuable inputs.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mithas, there's a question for you where a participant has asked that you spoke about offenses under IPC which are there under GST law also. So please elaborate the same and about exclusive jurisdiction under GST law.
That is like if you restrain the officers for exercising their power. If you see the IPC, if any of the government officer is restrained by anyone for exercising his duty, that is an offense. Therefore, similar kind of provisions should not have been inserted. Similarly, if there is a falsification of records, etc., when there is a fraud is committed, the fraud is an offense under the IPC. Therefore, such kind of offense should be taken under the IPC only. Otherwise, what would happen? The offenses are made under the GST, and the similar offense, if we can see the Guwahati High Court judgment, recently a year back, when the similar issue arises, the police is also registering a case on the custom authority complaints, and the custom authority is exercising the power. Therefore, there are 4 or 5 clauses under section 132 are there, where it appears that the offenses are already there. And in fact, once we represented in the committee meeting through SOCHM participated, it was considered that we will delete these offenses because these are the similar to what is there in the IPC.
Right, sir. Another issue which is being raised is, again, like there are multiple issues on cross charge, etc. So one of the issues is being raised is with regard to the salary cost lying upon Columbia Asia, etc. So when we are talking about provisioning or support services from head office to the plants, etc., whether the salary cost has to be included or not. So basically, I think we all understand there is no GST on salary. So that is never an issue, that there is no GST on salary. The real issue is that there is a deeming provision under the GST law. The deeming provision says, I will treat head office as a separate legal person. I will treat branches as a separate legal person. If you are providing a service from head office to the branch, then pay tax on that particular service. How do you value that service? They say you take it as an open market value. But there is no open market value which is actually available because I'm not providing, this head office is not providing any other services to third party. So what practically the rule says is go to the costing principles, apply cost plus 10%. So how do you ascertain a cost of a service provider? How do I ascertain? Say I'm also into a consultancy division. I provide consultancy litigation services. How do I ascertain my cost? My way of ascertaining my cost will be based on my office cost, my salary cost, my manpower cost, overheads, etc. So that's the costing principles by virtue of which this salary is getting included indirectly, though there is no GST on such salary, etc. So this is again an open issue. What generally we have seen is the practice is that if full credit is available, you can always rely upon proviso to the second proviso to Rule 28 and charge as reasonable basis. However, if full credit is not available, whether you have to add salary cost or not is a debatable issue, not yet settled. Though arguments are available, it's an employee of the entire organization, not of a particular branch. So you cannot deem it to be a service. In fact, this deeming provision of cross charge itself is constitutionally challengeable. What the Constitution says is that tax has to be levied on supply of goods and services. So what you actually mean by supply? Can I supply something to myself? How do you interpret supply? When an earlier pre-GST regime, when the provision in the Constitution was with regard to sales tax, sale of goods, there the court interpreted that the sale cannot be read to mean works contract, chattel has to be sold as a chattel. There, then the deeming provision under the Constitution was interpreted. Now in GST regime, how this term supply will be read, and this deeming fiction of treating one single entity as two different persons by a deeming fiction and enabling the supply between the one registration to another registration. Is it actually a supply within the meaning of the term supply which is used in Constitution? It's itself a matter of concern which we have to see how it will be ultimately upheld in future. I think another question which is raised is that some officer has not issued the notices, not uploaded on the portal, etc., but has directly passed the order. Can we go and ask for revision of order? So to my mind, or instead of appeal, is it a mistake apparent from record? So to my mind, it is an issue related to non-followance of principles of natural justice. So in this case, you can easily you can directly even go to the High Court or file an appeal stating that no notices have been issued, no opportunity has been provided, and either at the High Court or at the appellate level, you will be eligible to get the relief at both stages. So it's a commercial decision wherein you have to decide whether you directly want to go to a High Court or go to a appeal. Any other question? I think we have taken most of the questions now.
Okay,
And
sir.
further, we can share the PPT as desired by the participants.
Yes, lots of participants are asking for it. So thank you very much. That brings us to end of this very informative session on this GST. And on behalf of SOCHAM, I would like to convey my sincere thanks to our co-chairman, Shri J.K. Mittal, and our partner, Tathwam Advisor, their panelist, Mr. Pritam Goyal, Ms. Geetika Shiva, and Mr. Tushar Agrawal for sharing their views with the participants. And would like to thank all the participants for sparing their time in attending this session. We'll share the presentation with you in a day or two, and we look forward to have you with us for the future program. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.